Internet. For my U.S. history class, we are discussing World War I and World War II, and I want to express my thoughts with a comparison between presidential leaderships between World War I and World War II. Ultimately, I will be comparing and contrasting Woodrow Wilson from World War I and Franklin D. Roosevelt from World War II. But before we begin, I thought it would be beneficial to establish some basic background before getting into the meat of this video. Now, Woodrow Wilson was the 20th President of the United States and was in office between the years of 1913 and 1921. Now, as World War I lasted from 1914 to 1921, Woodrow Wilson was president for the entire war. Now, just as a reminder, World War I was a conflict mainly between European countries and consisted of the Allies, who were mostly France, Great Britain, Italy, Russia, and eventually the United States. And they were in conflict with the Central Powers, who were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is today Turkey. And Franklin D. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was the 32nd President of the United States, and he was in office from 1933 to 1945. Unfortunately, he died before the end of World War II, which took place at the end of his presidency from 1941 to 1945. World War II was a brutal conflict between the Allies, USA, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, and the Axis powers, who were basically Nazi Germany and Japan. As war is an extremely difficult time, it really brings out different leadership styles of those in charge of the country. Now, one aspect of both presidents that I commend was their ability to make difficult decisions, especially with becoming involved in international conflicts, despite initial public disapproval. More impressive still, both presidents initially pursued agendas to maintain neutrality and isolation so as to not get involved with international problems and rather focus on America's own problems. Both presidents held out for a while before turning points and events in the war kind of forced their hands. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the general public was against fighting the wars. Yet, even though the presidents likely could have gone to war regardless of the citizens' opinions, both presidents saw the importance of having support from American citizens. Both presidents ran propaganda and programs to convince people that the war must be fought, and all citizens had to contribute and be patriotic in order to help the United States win. I think we can agree that both of their efforts were effective for providing both the funding and resources to aid the military and their goals. While it may seem from these few examples that President Wilson and Roosevelt had the same leadership strategies, there are some small and some major differences that stood out to me from my class material. I found Wilson to be a more reserved and more self-focused president who was met with multiple failures and fewer major actions as a president. I noticed that literature often mentioned upcoming elections as reasons for him not acting in order to try to gain favor with the public opinion. This convinced me that Wilson was less of a true leader than Roosevelt. However, I'm not saying that Wilson was not a good leader because he did extremely well and seems to have gotten involved in World War I a lot sooner than Roosevelt got into World War II. I mean, he was able to do this by sending supplies to allies since Wilson was not hindered by legislation, whereas Roosevelt was. On the flip side, I found Roosevelt to be a more vocal, influential, and powerful president because it seems to me that he took more initiative due to not being focused on elections. Additionally, he appeared to have more accomplishments than Wilson. Now, despite being pro-isolation and neutrality and not getting involved in international conflicts, Roosevelt was aware that America would eventually have to join the European fight. He had a more difficult time convincing the American people that war was needed, as America was suffering from the tail ends of the Great Depression, in addition to the negative impacts of World War I still being fresh in memory, because it ended approximately 20 years earlier. Now, Roosevelt took an active role in preparing America for the war and ensuring that it would be ready for the conflict, as could be seen with his extremely vocal fights for changes in law. In particular, he paved the path for America's involvement in World War II by convincing Congress to alter laws such as the neutrality law to allow for cash and carry. This allowed for America to sell military technology to their allies. Another notable difference in leadership between the two presidents was the manner in which they represented the United States. Both were powerful men who proved to the world the dominance of the United States, but I am convinced that Roosevelt made America appear to be a more formidable foe to enemies. Roosevelt took an active role and met with his two powerful allies, who were the other two of the world-known Big Three. And he met with them a lot more frequently than President Wilson met with his allies at the time. It also seems to me that Roosevelt's involvement with big events like the Atlantic Charter demonstrated to the world just how powerful the United States was when provoked, whereas Wilson only really appeared internationally once the war was over for the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. All in all, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt had different leadership styles, which were perhaps more effective for each own's time period. World War I and World War II were different wars centered around different situations, so I really cannot say that one president had a more effective leadership style than the other. I mean, who knows how Wilson would have reacted to an attack in the United States like Pearl Harbor. Maybe he would have responded with the force and would have been just as vocal as Roosevelt. But regardless, I found Roosevelt's leadership tactics to not only stand out more, but to be a more effective for leading the United States, especially during his era. Thank you for listening.